chair of the North Craven Building Preservation Trust and honorary curator of the Museum of North Craven Life at the Folly. She has a great experience in museums, collections and libraries, and is an independent consultant. She was the librarian and keeper of the collections at the Scott Polar Research Institute at Cambridge, and other involvements have included Scarborough Museum and the University Museum of Zoology at Cambridge, as well as being a trustee of the Gilbert White and Oates collections at Selborne. So I would like to hand over to Heather, who's now going to be speaking on reflections on the role of cultural heritage. And if you would like to mute yourselves now, so that would help, I think. Okay, so over to Heather. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Pam. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to everybody this evening. I'm delighted to be able to contribute to the work of the Heritage Trust in this way. I'm just going to start screen sharing so that I can get my PowerPoint presentation up. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
That's lovely. Good. All right. So this is very much a sort of personal reflections this evening, rather than anything very formal. But it's a chance really to look at the work that I have done really over the past, getting on for 40 years, in a whole range of different venues and settings, all of which have cultural heritage at their heart. So let's see if I can get this to work. Doesn't want to move on, not sure why. How's that? There we are. So I thought, first of all, it would be an idea just to sort of quickly tell you a little bit about my background. I read what is laughingly known as English Course 2 at Oxford University, which basically means, as Anne will know, you don't do anything really beyond 1500. So I never got as far as Shakespeare. So it's Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic, essentially, is my background. And I went along to what is known as the Appointments Committee, which is the career service, having done my 3 years as an undergraduate, completely not knowing what direction I wanted to head in. And they suggested that I become a computer programmer, because that's what they were suggesting everybody should do in 1981. And I said I didn't want to do that. And on my way out, I picked up a leaflet for a Sconnell traineeship. Now, this is the standing conference on national and university libraries, and they had this fantastic traineeship scheme. And I thought, where would I fancy going? Where do I want to go? And I thought, well, you know, a year in London might be fun. I'll apply to the British Library. And much to my surprise, I actually was offered a place to train there for a year. So I spent a year there, having an absolutely wonderful time, both in the old British Museum building and working in amongst the collections in catalogue and classification. And that then led me on to do a further degree. I went to Aberystwyth to do my librarianship degree. And then immediately I'd completed that, I got an invitation, in fact, from Gonville and Caius College to be interviewed as their new librarian, assistant librarian in those days, because of course the librarian was a fellow of the college. And that had come about because I'd actually applied to be the sub-librarian at Trinity College, Cambridge. And I hadn't got an interview for that, but they had rather oddly passed my details on to Gonville and Caius. So I went trotting along to Gonville and Caius College, not really knowing very much about it. And again, was offered the job. And I arrived at the very end of September in 1983 to find that the library had been closed for the best part of a year for building work, that they had emptied all of the undergraduate collections into the inner library, which was their manuscript and rare book collection, in a great big heap. And this was about a fortnight before the college was due to open for the new academic year. And there was I, first professional post, not a clue in the world about how to do anything really. And I just set to, and I managed to find 4 incredibly helpful postgraduate students to come and help me put all the books back on the shelves, just in time for reopening. It was an absolute baptism of fire, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. It was just one of those things that I thought, actually, this is something that I can do. It gave me enormous confidence to actually just get on with the job, and actually having to handle every book in the library. And it was a sizable collection. It was around 50,000 volumes. And we had to basically just reshelve the whole lot. It really was a fantastic way in to actually understanding how that library worked. It was an extraordinary experience. I was there for 11 years, in fact. It has the largest medieval manuscript collection in Oxbridge, and I was privileged actually to work with that medieval manuscript collection and their very fine early printed book collection. A lot of very good medical materials there. I then went on to Sydney Sussex College Library and had a further 10 years with them, really just sort of bringing that entire library up to date, computerizing the stock, doing a lot of rebuilding work, and really getting to know the sort of political side of libraries in Cambridge. And from there, I moved out of the college libraries into the Scott Polar Research Institute, first of all as their librarian, and then as keeper of collections, which meant that I was looking after the largest collection on polar matters, not just a library, but a museum, archives, and a very extensive picture library, and that included audio and film as well. And it's the largest collection in the world to do with the polar regions, the Arctic and the Antarctic. And I started there in 2004, and I was there for another 10 years. And that was an extraordinary, really very, very interesting position to be in. I was really privileged to be able to travel a great deal in that job. So I have been and spent a considerable amount of time with communities in the Arctic, and actually down in the Antarctic, actually lecturing down there as well, to the descendants of Shackleton's Endurance Voyage, which was a really very, very interesting experience to go on. In 2015, I set up a consultancy. I moved to Yorkshire, and I have since then been working for the National Lottery Heritage Fund as a consultant, and they send me off all over the place. I work independently, but I also get sent out by the National Lottery to advise various organisations. And it can be anything and everything. Quite often I'm dealing with organisations that are in some difficulty. So I'm doing business development a great deal of the time. And as part of that, I spent a year as the CEO of Scarborough Museums Trust as they were going through a major restructuring. And actually, I drove through the merger with the Creative Industries Centre there. And then I went on to Cambridge, back to Cambridge, to finish off a major redevelopment of the University Museum of Zoology. And that was a very, very interesting year to spend, taking what was essentially the shell of a museum and making sure that everything was ready to have everything unpacked and redisplayed, and a complete new interpretation, new website, all sorts of extraordinary things to do, new shop. Very, very interesting year to spend. and at the end of it to actually arrange for David Attenborough to come and open the museum for us, which he did in real style. We had a wonderful day celebrating the fact that after 5 years, the museum had actually managed to reopen to the public. And then, as Pam mentioned, I've done a great deal of voluntary work in my career, now with the North Craven Building Preservation Trust, looking after the Folly and the Zion Chapel complex as well, but also as a trustee of Gilbert White's House and Gardens, where we've just finished another major redevelopment and opened up the brew house. So they've actually put a nano brewery into Gilbert White's own 1746 brew house. And throughout my career, I've worked with some wonderful colleagues in a voluntary capacity on a huge number of different projects in a lot of different organisations. So that gives you a little bit of background about me, but I thought what I really wanted to do today was talk about cultural heritage, and that is pretty much everything from Stone Age Britain to the iPhone 13, because cultural heritage essentially encompasses everything that we do. It is a human creation intended to inform in its simplest way. What do we mean by cultural heritage? This was the simplest way of expressing that I could find, and this was written by John Feather in 2006, and I think it's actually a very, very illuminating way of looking at cultural heritage. It's a slippery subject, as I discovered in trying to sort of work my way into all sorts of different libraries, archives, museums, gardens, you name it. It's very difficult to find a kind of connecting thread, except that we are, as a species, we are storytellers. And the thing that really connects everything is that everything we do in cultural heritage is intended to tell a story about who we are, where we've come from, what we want to do next. And I think this is a very simple way of saying that. So we divide up cultural heritage into these categories just for simple, sort of a simple way of dealing with it, really. So we have the built environment, and of course the Folly is my kind of starting point for that at the moment. But not just the building itself, but the townscape in which it sits, its conservation area, all those sorts of things actually have a bearing. The natural environment is one that's often not really sort of understood well in terms of cultural heritage, but I think is actually a very important one to consider. Then there's the intellectual environment, which really encompasses everything that we do to record our own heritage and history. And of course, we're moving now into not just the sort of recording that we have been used to, but actually electronic recording, and with that comes an extraordinary new range of challenges. And then finally, the creative environment, which is, if you like, intangible heritage to a large extent. So let's start with the built heritage, and I thought it was probably a good place to start would be the Folly. This is a building familiar to many of you, I'm sure. And of course, what we're dealing with at the moment is a major problem with the Folly itself, and we've actually discovered that there's a large crack that has appeared in the tower arch at the back of the building. And that fact really made me start to think, what is it about buildings such as the Folly that we value, and why? And why do we put such efforts into trying to maintain them? And we have this whole idea that there should be some sort of preventive conservation of this historic built environment, because these sorts of buildings are seen to have value to us. We understand them as part of our history, and without those buildings we don't have an anchor, it seems to me. They are absolutely essential in the stories we tell one another and tell ourselves about the lives that we have led in the past. So through deep time, the structures that we have created from, let's say, Stonehenge, but in fact going back much further, right through to the present, certain buildings, and they tend to be very iconic buildings, really resonate with, if you like, the recipients, the audiences for the built heritage and cultural heritage generally. And we spend an enormous amount of time and effort and money looking after them. And I have to remind myself that we do this in the face of the knowledge that actually this is a sort of a thing which is almost bound to fail in the very, very long term, because there are very few examples of the built heritage that survive for more than a few centuries. And whilst it's very important to us now, we do this knowing that in the very long term, these buildings will not continue to exist. But they have a function, and we find new functions for them in the period in which we encounter them. And I think that is vital, because we have to look after these treasures that we are gifted, if you like, that have been passed down to us. And in doing so, we are able then to hand on to the next generation the stories that the building tells us and that the contents of the buildings can tell us as well. And it would be very depressing, and I think we would all just stop doing things if we thought that there was no point, because it's all going to fall to pieces anyway. And it's I think, a really interesting sort of psychology, human psychology, to be able to think, yes, it is important to do this, to preserve this particular thing which is important to us now, because it will be important for future generations, not into the very, very long term, but for as long as we can imagine forward. And I was talking to somebody the other day who said, it is impossible to imagine the lives of our great, great grandchildren. And I think that is a really interesting point, that we can really only cover the next 2 to 3 generations, thinking forward. Beyond that, we have no idea what life is going to be like. So we're doing this sort of, I've called it value mapping. It's actually looking at how the things that we find of value within the built heritage are accessible to us now and for the next few generations, and making sure that they are sustained and can be sustained for as long as possible. And that sustainable development is something that is of concern, of course, to a great many people in the UK and around the world, especially now in the with the sort of current problems that there are affecting buildings such as this, with climate changing, with a decline in audiences, and with certainly a decline in financial support for organisations in the cultural heritage sector. So let's move on to the natural environment. And this is, I think, a very interesting one, because we tend not to think of landscape in a cultural heritage context. But almost all of the landscapes and natural environments that we look at in the UK, particularly, it's not always the case elsewhere, but certainly in the UK, are the product of a really complex history of interaction between people and the environment. What we see is rarely in its sort of pristine natural state. We've interfered to a very great extent in the environment over millennia. And now we are looking at a process of conservation of what remains with fresh eyes, essentially. And that need to ensure that there is conservation, to balance it with access to the natural environment, and to make sure that the environments that we are really stewards of at the moment remain sustainable, particularly in the light of a changing climate, and that is a very important factor at the moment. I think that that sort of set of concerns, they all interact. They're actually quite difficult to prioritise, but they are essential if we are actually to have landscapes that we currently really enjoy and love and cherish, that we can actually hand those on to another generation, where we are seeing degradation of landscape, of the need for, the pressures on it for housing, for agriculture, all sorts of things. Very, very complex web of interaction that's required, even now, to make sure that landscapes and habitats are preserved for the future. From a personal point of view, the sort of main interaction that I've had with the natural environment from a professional point of view was the attempt to develop a sort of rewilding and a redevelopment of an area in Scarborough where the art gallery has a garden at the back of it, which adjoins the gardens of Wood End, which was the home of the Sitwells, which is where the Scarborough Museums Trust actually keeps their stored collections. And in actually looking at these two buildings, which are next door to one another, it became very apparent that they were part of probably a Victorian landscape, Valley Gardens, and that they had almost entirely lost their form, if you like. They had become so overgrown, with lots and lots of sycamore sort of weed trees, and walls had collapsed, pathways had disappeared. And we started to put together a programme to actually understand the shape of the Valley Gardens and to see what we could do to bring back into public use that particular stretch of the landscape of Scarborough. And that was a really interesting project to work on. And I unfortunately had to leave it before it was completed. And in fact, another programme of work to restore the Southcliffe Gardens has taken priority. But I understand that work is actually still happening on that at the moment. As I mentioned, I started out working in libraries, and I thought I would just show photographs of some of the libraries that I actually did work in. So the top left-hand photograph is actually a photo I took of the rare book collection at Gomble and Keys College when it was in its original site within the college precincts. And the photograph below is actually the college library as it exists now. It moved into what had been the original university library in Cambridge, which had in fact been turned into the Squire Law Library. And when the new Squire Law Library was built, this building adjacent to Gonville and Keys College was vacant, and the college actually purchased it from the university. And it was my job to work out how all of the contents of the old college library would then sit in the new library space. And the college spent an absolutely extraordinary amount of money refurbishing this very, very beautiful building. It's on 2 floors, and one floor now houses the archive, and the other has this rather extraordinary undergraduate library. And it was a real privilege to work with this collection. Very, very interesting collection indeed, and much loved, as you can imagine, by the undergraduates. The photograph in the middle is actually from one of the medieval medical manuscripts in the collection, and I actually spent a lot of time working through all of the medical material that was there, and putting a lot of the earliest manuscripts through a program of refurbishment, because there were some very, very interesting original bindings which were in pretty poor condition. And I was very, very fortunate to have a lot of advice from Sandy Cockrell, who was one of the great Cambridge bookbinders and a craftsman bookbinder who lived in Grantchester. And this is back in the early 80s, you have to remember. The college basically said, oh, you should just go round to Mr. Cockrell in Grantchester and take the manuscripts with you, and he'll take a look at them. And I said, well, take them how? And they said, oh, just, you know, put them in a plastic bag in your bike basket and cycle round, and he'll take a look. And that's what I did. Once a week for several years, I would go and have an afternoon talking to Sandy about medieval binding structures. And it was an absolute education in itself. He was incredibly generous with his time. We spent a lot of time actually disbinding medieval manuscripts, taking a really good look at the structure, and then he would do the necessary repairs and replace skins and various things that needed doing. And I learned such a lot about the way that books were actually constructed, quite apart from their content, in that few years. So that was a sort of seminal part of my career. The photographs on the right at the bottom is the undergraduate library at Sydney, Sussex, which is a much more kind of utilitarian space than the one at Gonville and Keys, but an interesting library in its own right. And above that is the new extension to the library at the Scott Polar Research Institute. And that is one of the faddish, I would say, round libraries in Cambridge. Books aren't round, they aren't designed to fit into round buildings, and yet there was a great vogue for building round libraries, and this is one of them. But libraries actually are a very important part of our cultural heritage. They are cultural artifacts in their own right, because they are often in quite important buildings. They gather together huge quantities of material which we share. But the vital thing about them is that they transmit a huge amount of historical information on every subject under the sun. And obviously, this is a very biased glimpse. It's a very partial glimpse of libraries from my career, and there are many, many more out there which have the most extraordinary impact on almost everybody in the world, actually, directly or indirectly. Everybody is affected by our intellectual experience through libraries. I went to an International Federation of Library Associations conference many years ago now, and one of the most extraordinary conversations I had was with a librarian from Peru, whose library service was on the back of a donkey. And the donkey basically went up into the Andes with the librarian, and they took books and magazines and various things with them on a journey, which would take 6 to 8 weeks to get to the remotest communities in the Andes. And I just thought then what a privilege it was actually not to have to go on the back of a donkey to work every day. And I just thought, you know, we exist in this extraordinary culture where we want to share information. So let us move on from libraries to museums. Really, for the last, I suppose, 25 years, I have been involved in museums in some way. And museums share information in just the same way that libraries do, but they use different media. So we take, if you like, what is regarded as the best of our culture, and that can be on any topic from any period, and we share it, we display it, we have to acquire it, we do all sorts of conservation to it, we try to explain it, and then we end up with lots and lots of activity that surrounds the collection that we have. Museums fascinate me. I am perennially interested in the impulse to collect. I'm not a natural collector, I discover. I'm very grateful to those who are, because museums would not exist, I think, without that collecting impulse being very strong in certain people. They obviously date back to, if you like, the sort of 16th and 17th century cabinets of curiosity, and then have a sort of great growth after the 18th century period of collecting on the Grand Tour, with Victorian collectors in particular, and the growth of personal collections, which are then gifted to often to town councils and borough councils, as in the case of Scarborough. And this is Scarborough's Rotunda Museum, which many of you may know. And we have here an example of the earliest purpose-built museum in Britain. This is the William Smith Museum of Geology. And I put in some photographs as well of the art gallery here, and the two together actually form the Scarborough Museums Trust. I'm going to move on briefly to the creative environment and some national living treasures. These are just three of my favourites. One, Dan Nelson will be familiar to you as a settled resident. But John Lord, very well known as a flint knapper, who has taught us a huge amount about what we know about the prehistoric environment and the development of flint tools. And Owen Jones, who is the last oak swill maker who lives in the Lake District, who was the last person to be constructing oak baskets in the traditional manner. And I think we can fully appreciate that these skills that they have make them into national living treasures. And it's my great hope that the skills that they have developed will be passed on to the next generation. Craft skills, I think, are vital. The red list of endangered crafts actually includes some which are now completely extinct in the UK. And 56 crafts, which I think is extraordinary, 56 which are critically endangered. We're simply not letting these things sort of disappear. And young people, I think, have got to be given opportunities to try their hand, to actually learn from the last of their these extraordinary makers who hold generations of skill and craft in their hands. They have been essentially given the gift of a long series of sort of abilities, really. If you think of the way that skills develop, these are passed down through hundreds, if not thousands, of years of person-to-person contact. And we are at real risk now of losing some of these skills. You may think that, yes, why do we need somebody who knows how to make a lacrosse stick? But what a sadness it is, I think, to see these things completely disappear. The same, I think, is true of the really intangible heritage, the songs and traditions that we hand on from one generation to the next. And I've included here the carols sung in pubs in South Yorkshire, the folk music which carries on all over the country. I'm very, very pleased to see folk music being revived as it has been. And I've put a photograph here of the Pancake Bell in Scarborough, which is rung on Skipping Day. The original bell is actually in the Scarborough Museum's Trust collection. So really, just to sort of round up, I wanted to just talk about the sense of cultural identity that we have. And this really comes out through these sort of phases: the acquisition of material and the knowledge that surrounds it. It is no good acquiring anything unless it comes with a story. We have to capture the story as we capture the object. We then have to make those objects available to our audiences, and our audiences are in all shapes and sizes. They come from everywhere. You never know who is going to ask the next pertinent question, and we hold on to material because it gives us this sense of a shared heritage, a shared cultural identity. We spend a lot of time and energy and money preserving the collections that we have, preserving the buildings that hold them, preserving the landscapes that surround those buildings. And why do we do this? Because we feel it is important. It is important for the next generation to learn and to engage with this material. And I was this weekend in Norwich Cathedral, where Dippy the dinosaur is on display. And I thought, yes, this is a very, very good example of preservation. This is actually a cast of a dinosaur, acquired by Andrew Carnegie and given to the Natural History Museum because he felt it was really important that particularly young audiences should understand about dinosaurs in particular, but that there is this sort of deep time sense of our cultural identity. And what was so extraordinary was that there were hundreds, literally hundreds of school children passing through the cathedral, which is a great cultural icon in its own right, to see another cultural icon, Dippy, there for the duration. I was very glad to actually catch up with it on its tour. So then just really in conclusion, the heritage cycle. And I think it's worth just sort of reviewing this, because I think it actually does tell us a lot about why we care. And I think that is the critical thing. Because by understanding the environment, people do value it. And that value that they give to it encourages them to want to care for it. And by caring for it, they are helping audiences to enjoy it. And from that enjoyment, you get this wish to understand, and then you're back to the understanding. So you have this virtuous circle, if you like, and we are engaged within cultural heritage in trying to get people to actually become part of this cycle. And for me, the most important part of all of this is sharing the knowledge that we acquire with as many people as possible, and really instilling, particularly in the next generation, the wish to continue this process of engaging with our culture. I think at that point I'm going to stop and say thank you very much indeed. I've included here one of my favourite Inuit sculptures. Some of you will know that one of the byproducts of me working at the Scott Polar Research Institute is that I actually now have an ever-growing collection of my own of Inuit sculpture, carvings and prints. It's a dangerous hobby. I did say I wasn't a collector, but this is my one exception. And this is a rather beautiful piece called A Dream of Flying, made of relic whalebone and metabasic stone from Keewatin. And it reminds me, just to say in conclusion, that although I have concentrated to a very large extent on the English, British cultural heritage, the community that we serve is actually the whole world. It is a community of interest in any of the things that we cherish, that we look after, and that we share. And that, to me, is the vital part of the role of a curator, a librarian, a historian, a landscape historian, an archaeologist, anybody who works in cultural heritage in any capacity, passing on their knowledge to anybody that wishes to learn. Thank you very much.
Okay. Heather, I know that you're a little bit short of time now, so are you able to take one or two very short questions?
If I could just take one or two, that would be
one or two, yeah, and very, very quick ones. So has
Thank
anybody
you.
got anything that they want to ask Heather very quickly? Is there anybody?
I would like to ask Heather,
Yeah.
does the Yorkshire Fossil Festival happen every year? Is it an annual event?
It is. I think it didn't happen last year for obvious reasons, but yes, it is every year. So the big one is obviously down in Dorset, but it's run by the Scarborough Museums Trust, and I know that they are intending to hold it this year.
And is it always based in Scarborough?
It is, yes.
Right,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay. Has anybody else got a quick question? No. Okay. In that case, I shall pass over to Robin Bundy, who I think would like to just say a few words. Robin?
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Heather. That was very thought-provoking, I thought, and so relevant to the North Craven Heritage Trust. I mean, so many people perhaps regard as yet another organisation that puts on a programme of interesting talks and events, and I don't belittle the importance of those in terms of attracting people and providing them with information about our heritage.
Recording in progress.
But sorry, but we must, I think, as an organisation, continually assess and reassess what our real role is in North Craven. And I think you have demonstrated, particularly with sharing information about your background, that we couldn't have had a more